mentions how many people are suffering from sleep disorders and insufficient sleep. And it's really causing problems at all ages in our society. For example, children get, over the last century, each year they get about 1.5 minutes less sleep compared to the previous year. So that today they're getting about 2 hours less sleep in the United States per night than they did a century ago. Now, it's very unlikely that during that time period we have somehow evolved to need 2 hours less sleep per night for those kids. And so we're carrying around at all ages this burden of sleep deficiency. And it affects us in many, many ways. One of the things that I like to think about as a barometer of how sleep deprived we are as a society is just how many people are struggling to stay awake when they are driving. So every month, about 56 million Americans admit that they're having difficulty staying awake when they're driving. About 8 million of them lose that struggle and actually fall asleep at the wheel. And then that causes about 1 million crashes every year, 500,000 injuries every year, and about 55,000 of those are debilitating injuries that leave people either quadriplegic or seriously injured in some way. And it causes nearly 7,000 deaths every year. In fact, 1 out of every 5 car crashes is related to sleep deficiency in some way. And so it really represents a very serious problem. Maybe if I stand over here, it'll be less problematic. So the question is, why is it that we even need to sleep? And sleep fulfills many different functions in the brain and in the body. It fulfills basic biological needs in the brain in particular. The brain uses more energy than any other part of the body. It's only 2 to 3% of the weight of the body, and yet it uses 20 to 30% of all the energy that we use. Professor Stickgold is going to be talking about the importance of sleep on our ability to remember things, on memory consolidation. Sleep is also critical for us to be able to maintain our focus and attention and alertness, so that if kids don't get enough sleep before they come to school during the daytime, then they're not going to be able to focus and pay attention in class. One of the reasons why there are so many drowsy driving crashes is that our ability to sustain our attention at a task, like a routine, highly overlearned task like driving, is going to be greatly impaired if we have not gotten the sleep that we need beforehand. So our reaction time, instead of being 1/4 of a second, for example, will be 3, 4, 5, or 6 seconds, and the average reaction time will be 3 times longer than it is if we are alert. And so that can have real consequences. It can have consequences at all different ends of the spectrum. Athletes, even top professional athletes, their reaction time will be more sluggish, and they will get fewer. The basketball teams will get fewer players, will get fewer free throws in. The tennis players will get fewer serves in, and the runners will not be as fast when they haven't gotten enough sleep. And also, as Professor Stickgold will talk about, the different stages of sleep are associated with the ability to integrate what we have learned with what we knew before, and provides a critical function for that. But one of the other functions of sleep is, as I mentioned, there's this furnace using all of this energy in the brain, and it is during sleep that we replenish the energy that we have used up during the daytime. And one of the sensors that tells us that the brain needs more sleep is actually located on cells in the brain, and it represents, as we begin to use up the energy, and use up these energy stores, then some of the residual parts of the energy-related molecules build up in the brain, and we start becoming tired. And the brain starts being capable of making an involuntary transition from wakefulness to sleep. And of course, if that happens when you're driving, that can be very dangerous if you're struggling to stay awake and you lose that struggle. And the late Professor Bob McCarley was the one who discovered that it is adenosine levels building up in the brain that actually make us sleepy. And then ironically, what many of us do in order to sort of prevent that signal from getting through is we take caffeine in one form or another. And caffeine is a blocker of that receptor for adenosine. So it doesn't actually fulfill any of the biological need for sleep, but it blocks the receptor so that we are less likely to make that transition involuntarily. But it doesn't prevent it altogether. So think about that when you're sort of waking up and saying, "Oh, I can't function unless I have a cup of coffee." You would function better if you actually got the sleep that you need, rather than papering over that situation with something that blocks the receptors. It would be like taking, you instead of having your furnace come on when it's too cold in the house, you just put chewing gum in the thermostat so that you don't hear the fact, so that the signal is not transmitted that it's getting cold in the room. And of course, if that's the solution, then that can lead to burst pipes and all sorts of other problems. And in the same way, in the brain, if we don't get the sleep that we need, then we can't fulfill some of the key biological functions of sleep. And you can see the changes in this diagram. You remember that for a while that this is your brain on drugs. It was advertised on TV all the time. Well, this is your brain without a night of sleep. And you can see very specific changes. So this is energy utilization, and you can see in the area of the brain that's responsible for judgment, you can see that it is low on fuel, and so it is getting stone cold there. And that's one of the reasons why people who are not getting the sleep that they need are often exhibiting poor judgment in the decisions that they make. There's also, this is the area of the brain that relays sensory information from our vision, touch, and other senses to other areas of the brain. And this is the area that receives visual information. And we miss 10 times as many signals in our visual field. And that's one of the reasons why we have accidents when we're driving, because we don't even see the things that are happening. So we are much more likely to miss things that are happening. And that's why it's so dangerous to have, let's say, an air traffic controller who is responsible for seeing the planes on the visual field from a monitor, because they're not going to be able to pick them up as readily. And so this is one of the... Now, another really key function of sleep that has just only recently been discovered has been the clearing of toxins from the brain. So this high energy utilizing organ, like any other, anything else that uses a lot of energy, there are some byproducts, metabolic byproducts of energy that are essentially debris in the brain. It's kind of like in your car, you begin to build up sludge in the oil, and you need to change the oil and get the sludge out. Well, in the brain, we build up toxic metabolites like amyloid beta and tau protein, and if we don't clear those out, they can be toxic to neurons in the brain. And that's one of the things that's associated with, for example, Alzheimer's disease, is amyloid beta plaques. And it is during sleep that these newly discovered lymphatic channels actually expand and flush out these toxins when we are asleep. And that turns out to be a critical function of sleep, and once this was discovered in 2012, it began to make people realize why there was an association with both sleep disorders and with people with insufficient sleep with an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and other degenerative brain diseases. So one of the key functions of sleep is to help you maintain a healthy brain where these toxins are cleared out. Another key function of sleep is, and this has only been recognized in the last 20 years, that sleep is not only important for the brain, but is also critically important for the body. And so the cardiovascular system depends on sleep. It is during sleep that the heart is able to recover with a lower blood pressure and lower heart rate that happens during sleep, and repair can take place during that time. And people who don't get whose sleep is either interrupted or who get an insufficient amount of sleep, they will begin to have higher blood pressure. And sleep disorders, like sleep-disordered breathing, sleep apnea, is the leading known cause of high blood pressure. And so anybody who is diagnosed with high blood pressure should have an evaluation to find out if they have sleep-disordered breathing, for example. But even adolescents, even teenagers, if their sleep is disturbed or fragmented or insufficient, they will have higher blood pressure than their peers, so they are on the road then to hypertension. And sleep also turns out to be critically important for our resilience and our resistance to infections. So the immune system is affected by the sleep that we get. So in the fall, this past fall, we were advised to get a flu shot. And when people get the flu shot, if they haven't had an adequate amount of sleep in the week before getting the flu shot, they have only half the antibody response than they have if they are sufficiently well rested. Similarly, during the winter, if you're exposed to the rhinovirus that causes the common cold, you'll have a 200 to 300% increased risk of actually catching a cold if you're getting an insufficient amount of sleep or if your sleep is fragmented and disturbed. So consolidation of sleep, getting a sufficient amount of sleep, are both important for your immune system to function effectively. And that may be why, that may be one of the reasons why sleep fragmentation is associated with an increased risk of cancer and an increased rate of growth of cancer tumors, because the immune system is being recognized as playing a more and more important role as we begin to understand it in the prevention of cancer. Now, sleep is also critical for regulation of appetite. People often talk about the freshman 15, which is sort of the gain in weight that occurs oftentimes when kids start college. And that gain in weight may be associated with the increased or the decreased amount of sleep that kids get when they go to college. You see, somewhere during evolution, sleep and appetite got kind of linked, and maybe that's because it's not fully understood why that's the case, but the most other animals don't sleep deprive themselves spontaneously unless they're starving. And so, the big cats, if they're not getting enough food, they will stay up for 24, 48, even 72 hours on a hunt. And during the time when they sleep deprive themselves in order to avoid starving, their brain goes into starvation mode and releases more hormones that make you feel hungry and less of the hormones that make us feel satisfied with what we have eaten. The problem is that we voluntarily sleep deprive ourselves when we're not starving at all. In fact, many times we have the refrigerator right there. And so we're sleep depriving ourselves, watching TV, watching a game, doing this, working, the night shift or whatever we're doing voluntarily. And then we have a food source right there. So when we are having these hormones being released that make us more hungry and less satisfied with what we have eaten, then we are more likely to overeat when we are sleep deprived. And then people gain weight. And then one of the other amazing things that happens when people are sleep deprived is that in terms of metabolism, the effectiveness of insulin is reduced. And glucose levels go up to a higher amount in response to the same meal. So now you have a situation where people are gaining weight and the response of the metabolic system to food is impaired. And this puts many people on and may be contributing to the epidemic of both obesity and diabetes because of these metabolic changes. And because this increase in obesity and diabetes that have happened over the last 20 to 40 years have paralleled the decrease in sleep duration in our population and the increased problem with the epidemic of sleep deficiency in our society. And amazingly enough, even fat cells need to sleep. So that if you biopsy fat cells in people who are well rested, and biopsy fat cells from those same people when they have been chronically sleep deprived, the ability of those cells to respond and metabolize glucose is actually impaired from the individuals if they've been taken from individuals who are chronically sleep deprived. So the whole body is affected when we don't get enough sleep. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to argue that it's important to make sleep a priority. But it's not just the brain and the body, but even our emotions. We become much more volatile when we haven't gotten enough sleep. The risk of depression increases. The risk of suicidal ideation, anxiety disorders increase. Our ability to avoid flying off the handle when we are faced with an emotionally challenging situation becomes impaired, because and this has been studied here at the Harvard Medical School by looking at brain scans. The amygdala is a region of the brain that is responsible for emotional responsiveness. And so people in a scanner have been shown disturbing images, and the reaction, the response of the amygdala is 10 times greater in individuals who've missed a night of sleep as compared to those same individuals who are more calm in their response to these disturbing images if they have gotten a sufficient night of sleep beforehand. So it sets up sort of a perfect storm for situations in which we would not really want to place our children. And so you can imagine my surprise when I was bringing our daughter's now 24 years old, but when she was going to pre-K, a couple of decades ago, as nervous parents, my wife and I went to the pre-K school, and we sat down. They have you sit down in these little tiny chairs. And for me, that's a little bit of a challenge. So I'm sitting on these little chairs, and the teacher, we all want to know, how do we get our kids ready to go to preschool? And so she said, the most important thing that you can do to get your child prepared for school is make sure that they get a sufficient amount of sleep before they get here. And I'm looking around to see, did I have something, because does she realize that my whole life is spent on sleep? Whatever. And I went up to her, and she said, I can tell within the first 10 minutes after the children arrive here if you've been dragging them around in the mall and kept them up too late. And she said, I'm just going to call you on your cell phone and have you pick them up, because I'm not going to deal with them if you have not let them have a sufficient opportunity for sleep. So I went up to her afterwards and I said, have you been reading articles? Where did you find this information? And she said, no, I've been teaching for more than a decade, and I know what it's like to deal with children who are perfectly well behaved if they've gotten a sufficient amount of sleep, but are complete basket cases if their parents have kept them up before coming in. Maybe they were on a flight, maybe they were this, whatever. So, to this day, I'm stunned when I go to the malls or to a Walmart or to this or that at 10 or 11 o'clock at night and see in these 24-hour stores people, dragging around their kids, their young children. I made the mistake of commenting to one of the parents at one point, don't do that. But in any case, I was always struck by the kindergarten teacher and what she said. And the parents of very young children, will often say, Johnny or Susie is they're not themselves today. They're crying. They're fussy. Because they didn't sleep last night. So parents realize that for very young children. The teachers realize it for the 5, 6, and 7-year-old. But then somehow we think that children grow out of it and they don't need to sleep. But that's just not true. The behavioral manifestations are more subtle, but they are just as serious. So we have a situation today in which 1 out of 5 boys in high school is diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, the symptoms of ADHD, the symptoms of sleep deficiency, can masquerade perfectly the symptoms of ADHD. So difficulty focusing attention. We already see that that's one of the consequences of sleep deficiency. Emotional lability. That's another one of the consequences of sleep deficiency. Difficulty keeping your anger and under control. Another symptom of sleep deficiency. So yes, there are children with ADHD who need to be treated. But there are many, many more children who don't actually have ADHD, but they're misdiagnosed for ADHD because they're not getting a sufficient amount of sleep. and because it can't be that 1 out of 5 high school boys has this relatively uncommon condition. Now, as I mentioned, there are many, many different consequences of sleep deficiency, and I've just put a few of them on this slide. I've talked about the vaccination response, our distractibility, the increased risk of depression and suicidal ideation. Parents who don't set a 10 p.m. bedtime for their kids in high school, their children are at significantly greater risk of depression and suicidal ideation. Now, one thing that sometimes motivates kids, I was driving home a babysitter, and he was about 14 or 15 years old. And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I do research on sleep." And he said, "What a waste of time. I try to get as little sleep as I can." And I said, "Okay." I said, "It's during sleep that you release the hormones that turn you from a boy to a man." And the next week, his mother called me and said, "What did you tell my son?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, he's become a sleep czar. He's like, 'Mom, turn off the radio. I have to go to sleep. You're disturbing my sleep,' and so on." And sometimes when I tell the professional athletes, I say, if you sleep 4 hours a night for a week, you decrease your levels of testosterone by an amount that's equivalent to 11 years of aging. And they're like, "Whoa, maybe I should pay more attention to this." So let's talk a little bit about sleep disorders. So, and one of the most common ones is insomnia. Another very common one is obstructive sleep apnea. It affects about 1 out of 3 men and about 1 out of 6 women. So it's a very common condition in which the snoring is one of the most common symptoms of obstructive sleep apnea. And it increases the risk of cardiovascular death by an astounding 420%. And I'm just going to show you a slide that depicts survival. So this graph starts on the left when the participants in the study were about age 48 on average. And it follows the percent who are surviving. And the ones in white are the ones without sleep apnea, and the ones in red have sleep apnea. And we're going to follow them for 18 years when they would have been 66 years old. And you can see that at the beginning, there's not a very big difference between them. I mean, there's only about a double the risk of death. But then you see that the risk of the percent surviving is dramatically lower in those with sleep apnea. So by the time they would have been 66, only 58% of them are still alive, as compared to 94% of those without sleep apnea. And sadly, those who survive in the untreated sleep apnea group here, they get cognitive impairment about 10 years earlier and Alzheimer's disease about 5 years earlier than those without sleep apnea. So it's a real serious condition, and if you think that you might be at risk of it, you should really go to your doctor and have it evaluated. Now, let's see. There we go. Yeah. Well, Benjamin Franklin did say there'll be sleeping enough in your grave. And all I can say is you'll get there a lot sooner if you don't get enough sleep. So what are the things that steal our sleep? Well, one of them, it's a relatively new invention, is this electronic device, the iPad, or some sort of tablet. And it has two problems. Not only does it distract us and keep us from wanting to go to bed because we're engaged, it also bathes us in blue enriched light that makes us more alert. And it also suppresses the release of the hormone melatonin that helps us to go to sleep at night. And it shifts our circadian rhythms to a later hour, making it more difficult for us to wake up in the morning, and we're more tired in the morning. Other than that, it's no problem to read from the iPad before going to sleep. Caffeine has a 6 to 9 hour half-life, and it does keep people awake. And so, because it's awake promoting, people use it to stay awake, but they don't necessarily realize that it lasts so long. So I always cringe when I see people ordering, a double espresso after dinner. And they say, "Oh, it doesn't affect me." And it's true that there are inter-individual differences, and about 1 out of 4 people are particularly sensitive to the side effects of caffeine as compared to the others. But it does disturb the sleep of everybody. And of course, the television in the room and all the electronics, they should be out of the bedroom. You need to recharge, they need to recharge. So maybe it's better to have them recharge in another room. It's just something to think about. But of course, the goal is to be able to get sound sleep. And to be able to get sound sleep and get a sufficient amount of sleep, we need to make sleep a priority. And so there are things that you can do. You know when to wake up, and that's when you set your alarm for waking up. But one thing that can be very effective is setting a bedtime alarm. Figure out if you need about 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Then if you set an alarm, let's say 8 hours, because you don't sleep every moment that you're in bed, so 8.25 hours before you need to wake up, that will help you, remind you that it's time to go to bed. But there are several features that are critical for sleep. One is duration. Most adults need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep per night. It's critical that we get it at a consistent time. Disrupting the timing of your sleep can have just as adverse effect as getting an insufficient amount of sleep. So consistency in the timing of when you sleep and wake is really, really important. And then finally, the quality of sleep. If you have a sleep disorder, like sleep apnea, that is making it impossible for you to breathe and sleep, for example, at the same time, then you're not going to have good quality sleep, and that will interfere in your ability to function as well. If we do get the sleep that we need, then we're going to be more alert, we're going to perform better, our athletic performance, our cognitive performance will be improved, and we will also, just as a side note, we're actually more attractive to other people. There's a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in which they took portrait photographs of individuals when they had gotten a sufficient amount of sleep, and then when they had stayed up all night. They showered, they were all cleaned up for each of the two portraits, and people could tell within 4 seconds they were more attracted to the same person who was and these were 700 images that done a very systematic study, but they found the people who had slept to be more attractive. They wanted to spend more time with them, etc., than the people who were sleep deprived. So there are many pluses to getting the sleep that you need, and I thank you for your attention tonight.